Hi, and welcome back to Der Springen Poppen Garage, a place where a couple of guys preserve and repair obscure classic vehicles and try not to break the bank or go to the hospital. Today's episode, we replace the transmission on a Jaguar XJS. Here we go. It's Friday. Tom and John have decided to torture ourselves and continue working on Kara's 1993 Jaguar XJS with the 4-liter 6-cylinder. Now, as you can see, we have a lovely new paint job. We've got lovely new tires. We've done motor work on this thing. We've done pretty much everything. So just after the paint was completed, Kara's driving around and the car starts acting funny. And it turns out, well, the transmission has failed. So leaving the car undrivable. So what did I do? I went on eBay and I bought this. This is a used ZF HP424 4-speed automatic transmission. And I got this for a couple of $100 instead of spending thousands of dollars on a transmission rebuild. We're kind of rolling the dice with this, but it's a couple of $100 and there is like a couple of 1,000-mile warranty, so let's hope it lasts. So today we're going to pull the old one out from underneath. That's why the car's in the air. And we're going to put this one in. So now most of the time a job like this is performed in a garage with a proper lift, but we're going to just struggle on our backs here with hand tools. In this video you'll see that we're just doing some preliminary work, loosening bolts to the exhaust, getting the engine and the transmission propped up with the scissor jack, and making sure all the bolts we need, we can identify them and know exactly what we're working with and where we have to start. Next step is to loosen the transmission cross member, drain the transmission fluid, and start loosening more bolts at the drive shaft. So from the output of the transmission into the shaft that goes to the rear differential, there's 4 bolts there that we're loosening up and separating the two from each other. Now, when a transmission is filled with transmission fluid, it's quite heavy, especially the torque converter. So what we're doing here is we're disconnecting the lines and draining out all of the transmission fluid, well, at least as much as possible. And that's where Tom is wearing some gloves, so he protects his hands from that harmful transmission fluid while I just soak in it and wash my hands and bathe in it because I just love transmission fluid all over my hands, all over my body. Next step over here is loosening the nuts and removing the exhaust manifold, and this just makes it easier to get to the top bolts and to get to the transmission because there's a series of bolts all around the transmission that we need to get to, and this manifold's in the way. So we're just loosening all of this up. And I'll tell you what, I think the biggest pain in the ass of this job was really getting the manifold out. You know, some of these nuts are in such difficult locations where it was almost impossible to get a tool around it, or the tool was hitting something else. But thankfully I got it out and ready for the next step. After a bunch of kicking and punching and loosening and jiggling, we were finally able to get the transmission loose from the engine bell housing. So what we're doing now is we're just getting ready, splitting the two apart, loosening the final bolts, making sure we're not putting unnecessary pressure on the bolts or on the engine, and gently lowering the transmission, believe it or not, with a floor jack, and then dragging it across the garage floor out from underneath the car. Very high-tech stuff. All right, so we got the old failed transmission out, and this is the replacement one, and it took us about an hour and a half to get the old one out. And we had to remove exhaust, we had to remove all of the connections for shifter, accelerator cable, whatnot from here, and lower the engine, and disconnect the output shaft here that goes back to the rear differential. So just a lot of nonsense, and yeah, an hour and a half to do it. Not so bad. Tom doesn't like being in videos. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking these bolts. So we put these in, as we took these bolts out, we put them in the replacement gearbox just to make sure we've got the right lengths in the right location. So now as we're putting this one in, I'm going to put them in the old one so we remember the placement and we don't have to forget. And you got to keep track of all of this stuff, because if you don't, you get yourself in really big trouble. That's it. So before we put this new transmission in, we've got to look over the replacement one and make sure that they match. What we're doing here is we're taking the transmission filter and putting it on the new transmission, making sure everything's clean, all the gaskets look good, all the seals look good, making sure it's ready to go. Now that the new filter's in and the new gasket's in, it's time to put in the drain pan. Make sure that the gasket on that is nice and flexible, and making sure that the seal is good, so tightening all of that down with the clamps. Now we're using some parts from the old transmission and some from the new, depending on condition, and just tightening down the drain pan, getting ready for the next step. And the next step is putting in the torque converter. The torque converter is a little bit of a pain in the ass because you do have to match up some notches and make sure everything is lined up. It takes some time. Alright, here comes the exciting part. We've got the torque converter filled with transmission fluid. It's installed, and now what we're doing is we're just very gently and carefully lifting the transmission into position to get it on the jack, so we can then lift it to connect it to the engine. And this is a little bit of a pain in the ass. Check it out. Now once we got the transmission on the jack, we had to strap it to the jack to make sure it didn't fall over. And here's where the real pain starts. What we have to do here is we have to line up the bell housing from the transmission to the bell housing of the engine. And there's two dowels that you have to line up and match that have to get into each other before you can start tightening it down. And it's a very delicate process. You don't want to put bolts in and then not have the transmission lined up properly, because you can damage the threads. You can also damage the hardware, the bolts that you're connecting with. So here you can see we're using the scissor jack and the jack to lower the transmission and the engine and get everything lined up. From there, once we successfully lined it up, we're tightening all the bolts down, reconnecting all of the hoses. The car's all put back together, and now it's showtime. She's back on the road and running great. What good news. Thanks for watching the video. Follow and subscribe. Have a great night.